Well, we've got an exciting study for you this evening, brothers and sisters. Last time we looked at how God had been working with Britain in the past, and this time, God willing, we're going to be looking at how God is working with the nation of Britain currently and will be in the future. We're going to consider the relationship of certain nations just up until the time when the Lord Jesus Christ returns. And God willing, brothers and sisters, again we're going to find that God is working in our time. There is a God in heaven that we can be confident in and that we can trust and that we can see quite clearly at work, bringing around world events so that the prophecies of old can be fulfilled as has been revealed. So how do we do that? How do we find out what the nations are going to be like just before Christ returns? Well, one way is to look at what we call the Armageddon prophecies. Those prophecies which relate to world events when the Lord Jesus Christ appears on the scene. And Ezekiel chapter 38 is one of these prophecies that we've just read with Brother Alex a few moments ago. What's Ezekiel 38 all about? Well, quite simply, what it tells us is there's going to be an invasion upon Israel from the north, verse 15, by a number of confederate nations, and they're going to come and they're going to attack, particularly, verse 8, the mountains of Israel. They're going to come against the people. They're going to come to take a great spoil. And when we compare it with the other prophecies, which we call the Armageddon prophecies, Daniel 11, Daniel 2, Joel 3, Zechariah 12 to 13, Revelation 16, we understand that this is going to be the event just before Christ and the immortalized saints reveal themselves to the world and the kingdom age begins. So we can piece together quite a lot of the information that we're given. Just like we do with the Gospels, we compare all the Gospels together to get the bigger picture. We have to do the same with prophecy, particularly the Armageddon prophecies. Now, it's not our job this evening to go into immense detail, particularly about the invading nations which come against Israel, but we do wish to set the scene a little bit. If you look at verse 1, the Confederacy of Nations is headed up by one character. Son of man, set thy face against Gog. So we have this character of Gog, and it's thought that Gog would have been a character perhaps known by the people in Ezekiel's time, a great warrior from the north, a Scythian warrior, but that's by and by. So this is going to be a latter-day Gog, somebody like that ancient character of Gog, and it says there, he is from the land of Magog, the chief prince in the King James Version, or it's better translated, the Rosh of Meshech, Tubal, and prophesy against him. So we've got there a block of nations. We've got Magog, which if you do your research, you'll find that that's the area of Germany. So Gog is from Germany, but he's also the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Rosh is an ancient name for Russia, Tubal, Tobolsk, and Meshech, Moscow. So we've got somebody, so I always find this quite interesting as an aside, that we've got somebody who's from Germany who's a prince over Russia. And so that leads me to believe, at least, that perhaps we're talking here about a president who is from one area but is a chief over those other areas. If we go then to verse 5, we get more information about this confederacy of nations. We read of Persia, that's modern-day Iran. Ethiopia and Libya, they're African nations, northern African nations. And incidentally, you'll remember from the study last time that they're mentioned in Daniel chapter 11. We have Gomer, an ancient name for Gaul and France, and Togarmah, which is around the area of Turkey. So we have a pretty good idea of who's involved. You know, the other Armageddon prophecies that we've mentioned, they don't actually go into who the nations actually are. But here in Ezekiel 38, we get them identified. They are nations, ancient names for the nations that sit on these territories. And that makes sense, doesn't it, brothers and sisters? Because in Ezekiel's time, if he was talking to people and said, oh, well, the French are going to be involved, they'd be thinking, who on earth are the French? Because the French hadn't been invented back then. But the Gomer people had. So it's the names of the ancient peoples that were around at Ezekiel's time. And as we say, they come from the north, it says there in verse 15, and thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts. Some versions render the uttermost parts of the north, that phrase there. And as we say, this does link in with other prophecies. But, brothers and sisters, this is not... there is another set of nations which is mentioned in this prophecy. I don't know if you noticed it when Brother Alex was going through, but if you look at verse 13, we read of another set of nations, not part of this invading confederacy, a set of nations who challenge this invasion. Look at verse 13. It says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, and to go, art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, and to take a great spoil? And that's where we're going to head to in just a few moments to identify who Tarshish is. Before we do that, I just wanted to point out the fact that this is a latter-day prophecy. If you look in verse 8, it says there, after many days, thou, Israel, shalt be visited in the latter years. Thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. And then look at verse 16 again. And thou shalt come up against my people of Israel as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days. And again, that's a phrase you can go through your Bibles and find out more information about that time period. But just from reading those few verses and reading this earlier, we can see what time period the latter days covers. In verse 8, we've been told that Israel's back in the land after a period of being scattered. In verse 11, we read that there's going to be this time when they're going to dwell safely. And the Jews are going to be there, dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates. In verse 12, we read how that they've come to take a prey and to take spoil and to take the goods of Israel. So Israel are going to be wealthy within this time period of the latter days. And also, in verse 8, we read about the mountains of Israel. And in verse 12 as well, it mentions that they're going to come against those that are in the midst of the land of Israel. So there's going to be controversy, brothers and sisters, on a particular area within Israel, the mountainous region in the middle, the West Bank region. And we can say, brothers and sisters, quite assuredly that many of these things have happened. Obviously, Israel are back in their land. The nation of Israel, the state, 1948, came to pass. Verse 11, we can't really say that they're dwelling safely without walls, bars or gates. There is a picture that I took a few weeks back of a modern kibbutz. And each of the, what's a kibbutz? It's a Jewish settlement. And each of the Jewish settlements in Israel, they all have this like yellow gate. And all the way around their villages, they have a wall or a fence that goes all the way around. So I don't think we can say that has actually happened. Something's going to happen to take those bars down. But that could happen quite swiftly, couldn't it? Within a few months, they could all be down. Verse 12, as we said, it talks about them being wealthy. And I don't know if you've been keeping up with the news, but Israel have had an amazing discovery, a vast wealth of oil fields just off their coast, which people believe is going to make them one of the most big players in the energy market in the years to come. So they are wealthy. And we know, of course, of the controversy over Israel at the moment with Hamas scooting rockets across at them and all sorts, and particularly the problem with the Palestinians in the West Bank, where we have Jews who believe that the land is theirs, building settlements in an area which the international community believes they shouldn't be building them. So we have controversy over the West Bank area, the mountainous region in Israel. And so it can be a bit staggering, really, because suddenly we realize that we are, for sure, in the latter days. There's no doubt about that. And so we look, don't we, for the signs of the other events that are going to take place in just before Christ returns. And it is the time just before Christ returns. If you look at verse 18, it talks about God acting after this invasion. And it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. That's the time when God acts. In Zechariah it says that the Jews will at that time look at the one whom they pierced and mourn as Christ comes to save them from this invading force. As we said, verse 13, though, just before God acts, there's this, what we would call maybe a feeble challenge. We've read of 3 or 4 characters there: Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions thereof. And they say, have you come to take a spoil? Art thou come to take a spoil? Just keep your hand in Ezekiel chapter 38. I'd like you to just flick across to 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 18. Because here in 1 Kings chapter 17, we have the same Hebrew for the word art thou come. And it gives us an understanding of what this means. What does it mean when they say, have you come to take a spoil? Well, if you look at 1 Kings 17, it's a different context. It's Elijah, and he has some dealings with the widow woman. I'm sure you remember the passages. But particularly, she says to Elijah after her son falls sick in verse 18, she says, what have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance and to slay my son? Now what that tells us, brothers and sisters, it's the same word. Have you come to me? In other words, Elijah had physically come to speak with her. And so that gives us the idea of what this challenge is here when we flick back to Ezekiel 38. The Gogian force had come to the area where Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish were operating. And so they are saying to them, have you come? The Hebrew is the word bow, meaning to come or to enter. Have you come to us to do these things? So wherever Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish and the lions are, they are in the region where this conflict is taking place. And all they can do is ask the question. There doesn't seem that any further action takes place. They're not strong enough, it seems, to actually do anything about the great invasion. But the fact of the matter is they're there. So who are Sheba and Dedan? Well, we haven't got time, but we could go over to Genesis 10 and look at how they're descendants of Ham. And in Genesis 25, they're mentioned as going to the East Country. And we believe that it's this area here, the area of the Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula. The modern-day countries that inhabit that area are Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and Yemen. And what's interesting, brothers and sisters, is that these countries are Arab Sunnis. They're Sunni Muslims. I don't know if you know much about Islam, but that's quite significant because there's 2 types of Muslims in Islam. There's the Shia Muslims, Iran, Syria, the Palestinians, Turkey, Pakistan. They're all Shia Muslim countries. And they believe that following the Prophet Muhammad's death, that leadership should have gone directly to his cousin or his son-in-law, Abu Talib. But Sunni Muslims, the Shia and Dedan group, they're separate from the Shia Muslims, and Sunni Muslims believe that the new leader should have been elected from among those who were capable for the job. So there was this division very early on in Islamic history, a falling out in the Arab world. And again, brothers and sisters, we think, how amazing is that? The angels have been at work, even in that regard, to separate out these nations so they're different from the other Arab nations of the world. And what's even more fascinating is that these particular Muslims currently, the Sunni Muslims, they're slightly concerned at the extremism of Iran, because they know that after Iran, if Iran was to eradicate Israel, the Shia Muslims, guess where they turn their attention next? Well, on their brothers who they believe are wayward, the Sunni Muslims. So what we're starting to see is a nervousness with these nations, particularly about Iran getting nuclear weapons, and they're starting to lean a little bit towards Israel. And so keep an eye out for that in the news as they tentatively support Israel at a distance. Obviously, they're not too keen because they are Muslim countries as well. But let's what we would like to do now is to spend the rest of our class, after that setting the scene, so to speak, trying to identify who Tarshish is. Now, brothers and sisters, if I was to say to you, oh, who's Tarshish, I'm pretty sure the majority of us here would perhaps say, well, it's Britain. But brothers and sisters, if I was to then say to you, well, prove to me that it's Britain, I think we perhaps might struggle. And I don't think it's good enough, is it, to just kind of follow what we've heard. Surely we need to get down to it and have some good tangible reasons as to why perhaps we might suggest that Tarshish is Britain. And so, God willing, that's what we hope to do in this class. But what we have to do, brothers and sisters, is we have to be a bit like Sherlock Holmes. Okay, so we've got to go around and we've got to pick up some clues as to perhaps who Tarshish might be. And then we have to go through and see which nation those clues could fit to. And hopefully, as I'm sure by now you're aware, I believe that it is Britain. But hopefully you also will agree with that by the end of the class. So initially, what clues can we find straight up from here in Ezekiel chapter 38? Well, if you look in verse 13, we've already been told that they are the merchants of Tarshish. Now that's strange, isn't it? Because all the other nations that have been mentioned are just mentioned by their name. But here, we have the merchants of Tarshish, which seems to imply that only the merchants are in the vicinity of the conflict. Tarshish itself is not there, but the merchants, the traders, they are in the vicinity. So Tarshish is going to be somewhere else, but their merchants are going to be in the place where this conflict takes place. So that's our first clue. This is a trading power, and particularly a trading power who is there with Sheba and Dedan. They're in the Gulf. The word merchants means, in Hebrew, is kakar. It's used 20 times in the scriptures, translated as merchant 14 times, trade twice, merchantman once, panteth once, and that's in Psalm 38, my heart panteth, and traffic once. And the idea is it's being busy in trade. And Gesenius, a scholar, says that the word means to go around, to travel about countries for the sake of traffic, hence trade. So we're not dealing here, brothers and sisters, with a native power in the vicinity of Sheba and Dedan. We're dealing with a trading power who happens to be there at the time, who will also join Sheba and Dedan and say, have you come to take a spoil? But they're going to be connected, aren't they, with Sheba and Dedan. And incidentally, we'll look at this, God willing, in our next study in Psalm 72. In the kingdom age, Sheba are there with Tarshish in bringing a gift to Christ in the future. So there's a great strong link between Sheba and Tarshish and Dedan. So that's the first clue. They're a trading power. What about the second clue? Well, we've read there that they are there with all the young lions thereof. That's a bit of a peculiar expression, isn't it? Because we're talking about nations, and suddenly we read of these young lions. Now, I think, brothers and sisters, we can dispense with the idea that these are literal lions, because the context here is of national powers. I don't think Tarshish is literally going to have a herd of lions that it's going to have in the vicinity. I think this is talking about something else. The context is political powers. And, of course, throughout the scriptures, lions are used in that way. Jeremiah 1:17, for example. But also, if you flick back to Ezekiel 19, you'll also find they're used as a symbol of political powers here. Ezekiel chapter 19. And this one is talking actually about Israel, particularly. It says there, in verse 1, "Moreover, take thou up a lamentation for the princes of Israel, and say, What is thy mother? A lioness? She lay down among lions. She nourished her whelps among young lions. And she brought up one of her whelps. It became a young lion, and it learned to catch the prey. It devoured men." So here, clearly, we're talking symbolically about the behavior of lions being connected with a political entity, which is Israel. And it's speaking about how lions behave in the wild. You know, it's wonderful, brothers and sisters, isn't it? How God creates his creation, and that for us to find lessons from. And here he's showing us a lesson. And what happens is the lioness gives birth to cubs, whelps in verse 3. So they're like the baby lions, the little ones that look cute. And you think, oh, I'd love to take one of them home. And then you think, well, crumbs, he's going to grow into a big ravenous lion, so I better not. So we've got lions, the lion cubs, little whelps. And then if you look at the progression, it says in verse 3, it became a young lion. And that's the same word that we're dealing with in Ezekiel chapter 38. It is the Hebrew word kiphiah. And it's used 32 times in the scriptures. It's translated as lion 30 times, villages once, and young once. And what this idea of a young lion is it's different from a cub. It is an independent lion. And what happens is the males grow up and they leave the lion pride. They become independent. They come to almost start a pride of their own. And so they roam around on their own. And the idea is that there's a central pride that has this offspring of these young lions that are independent. And they are a power in their own right. And that's why, as we've said, it's translated as villages elsewhere, because it gives this idea of having a central point and then other independent power bases coming out of that central part. Someone has also suggested it perhaps is also the idea of a lion's mane. So you've got a central part, and then you've got these other areas coming out of it. And so Ezekiel chapter 19 uses this idea of course, as a young lion in relation to the leaders of Israel who had become independent powers in their own right and had started going about doing their own thing. But what does this tell us when we get back, and if we flick back now to Ezekiel chapter 38? Well, what it tells us is, brothers and sisters, if you look at the context, it's saying that these are the young lions that belong to Tarshish. So Tarshish is like a mother lion. And she's given birth to these whelps who have now grown up, they've become independent, and they are now young lions. They are capable of fending for themselves. And so what that tells us is that they're independent from Tarshish, but these are like, they come from Tarshish. So it's a colonial power. Tarshish has had offspring. So that's our second clue. We can't have, if you find a power that you think is Tarshish, if it doesn't have any demonstrable offspring, politically speaking, it is not Tarshish, because we have to have young lions. Tarshish is the mother lion, and its young lions are its offspring. Well, what about point number 3 then? What's our third clue? There's 8, by the way, you'll be pleased to know, and then we'll evaluate whether they fit with Britain. Well, another one is we're not going to have a great deal of time, so we're just going to flick through here. In Genesis chapter 10, we read of the descendants of Noah. And the Genesis chapter 10 has become known as the Table of Nations. And the idea is that all the ethnic and racial groups of humans can be traced back to the descendants of Noah, and particularly his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And according to Josephus, this is how where they emigrated to. So you have Shem, who emigrated to the Middle East and Israel area. You have Ham, who emigrated over to Africa. And you have Japheth, who emigrated to Europe and parts of Asia. And so when you consider that, another identifying feature of Tarshish, who comes under the sonship of Japheth, when you read Genesis 10, verses 4 and 5, you'll find that, as I say, Tarshish descends from Japheth. So wherever Tarshish is, it's not going to be in Africa, and it's not going to be in the Middle East. You might recall, actually, we did actually quote Genesis 10, verses 4 to 5 in our last class, and it said there, in fact, let's actually go there, because I do want to make one point there, very briefly. So we're going to go to the Table of Nations. And we read of the sons of Japheth in verse 2 are outlined. And it says in verse 4, the sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, and Kittim, and Doadim. And notice this, brothers and sisters, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. That word isles is quite interesting. You know, it doesn't just mean an island. Gesenius says it means a maritime land, whether the sea coast or an island. So again, we're not just looking for a descendant of Japheth, a nation within that pink area on the screen. We're looking particularly for either an island or a coastal region within that geographic area. Incidentally, in Isaiah 60 verse 9 and 66 verse 19, Tarshish is also mentioned in connection with isles. So that was clue number 3. What about clue number 4? We're not going to turn to these ones, I promise you. We've just put this on the screen. Tarshish is always connected to ships. So we read a lot of the ships of Tarshish. So there's some passages on the screen, as we say. We've got 2 Chronicles 9:21, Psalm 48:7, Isaiah 2:16, 23:1, 69, and then Ezekiel 27:25. We will turn to the Ezekiel one later. But the point is that this power of Tarshish is known as a maritime power. It's famous for its ships. It smells of sea salt. And whoever Tarshish is, it's not going to be a nation famous for land travel. It's going to be famous for sea travel. That was clue number 4. What about clue number 5? Well, clue number 5 is that it's located to the west of Israel. How do we come to that conclusion? Well, in Jonah chapter 1, and at verse 3, we read of how Jonah was told to go to Nineveh to give them a prophecy. And he doesn't want to. So he goes down and he wants to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. And so he goes down to Joppa and he finds a ship going to Tarshish. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us firstly that Tarshish, from the land of Israel, by the way, Joppa is in that vicinity there. Tarshish, wherever it is, it has to be approachable via ship. So you couldn't just walk there, otherwise Jonah would have just walked to Tarshish. And he's looking to flee as far away from the presence of God. What a foolish idea. But he was still trying to do that. He was trying to flee from the presence of the Lord. So he gets on this ship in Joppa. And Joppa is the modern-day Jaffa, which is just near Tel Aviv, just on the coast, the west coast. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that if he was going on the west coast to go to Tarshish, and he finds a ship that's going to go there, that wherever Tarshish is going to be, it's going to be on the west side of Israel, and it's going to be accessible via the sea. So that was clue number 5, located to the west. What about this one? Can we turn, brothers and sisters, now to Ezekiel chapter 27. And this really helps to narrow down the playing field as to where and who Tarshish might be. So we're going to go to Ezekiel chapter 27. Now I've got to give you a bit of background to Ezekiel chapter 27 so we can appreciate what it's telling us. In verse 1, the prophet's given the prophecy by God. The word of Yahweh, the Lord, came again unto me, saying, Now, thou son of man, take up a lamentation for Tyrus. So this is, Tyrus is another name for Tyre. Okay, where was Tyre? Tyre was to the north. It's just off the coast of modern-day Lebanon today, to the north of Israel. And Tyre, the people of Tyre, were known as the Phoenicians in ancient times. They're not called that in the Bible, but they are the Phoenician nation. And they were famous for their trade. The Phoenicians were phenomenal traders. You can see a map at the bottom here. You see that yellow line there. It shows how they'd gone all around the world, all around the Mediterranean at least. This is just the western side. They were also off on the other side, the east. And what they did was, they weren't particularly strong militarily. They weren't like a military power. But what they were fantastic at was setting up little colonies, little groups of people who would work with the natives of wherever they came across. And the natives would bring them all their goods from that particular area and then sell them to the Phoenicians, who would then put them on their boats and off they'd go. And then they'd stop back at that place at a later time. And you can see there that that's one of their ships engraved in a sarcophagus at one point, and some of their coins. And all of this depict the fact that they were an amazing trading power of the ancient world. And they do turn up in our Bibles, brothers and sisters, because you might remember a certain Hiram, who at the time of David allied himself with David, and who helped, in fact, supply the temple with particular goods when the temple was built. And he sent people down who were skilled to help build the temple and also King David's palace in Jerusalem. And it's my belief, brothers and sisters, because it says in Amos that they had a brotherly covenant with Israel. And it's my belief that they were, in fact, at that point, proselytes, that they'd converted to serve the God of Israel. And it's a sad fact that, unfortunately, they forgot their alliance with Israel and they turned their back upon God. And so now the prophet is told to deliver a message of doom to the people of Tyre. And so in verses 5 to 7, we read about the amazing ships that they had, the greatness of Tyre's ships which they traded in. In verses 8 through to 11, we read of the personnel of Tyre, how skilled they all were. In verses 26 through to 36, we then read of the fall of Tyre. Did I say verses 12 to 25, which is the important bit that we're going to home in on? And verses 12 to 25 talk about all the traders of Tyre, those that come and helped them become this great nation. And it's this list of traders that's interesting. And what it does, brothers and sisters, is it tells us the nation, and then it tells us the goods which were native to that country, to that area, to that nation. So, for example, in verse 14, we read of Togarmah. And what did they get from Togarmah? They got horses, horsemen, and mules. So the horses, horsemen, and mules, they were from Togarmah. In verse 15, we read of Dedan. And Dedan came to Tyre and traded with them with horns of ivory, and ebony. So the horns of ivory and the ebony, they came from Dedan. And then another one just out of randomness, verse 18, Damascus. And from Damascus came the wine of Helbon and white wool. And what God says is, you know, you think you're so great in the eyes of all these people, well, because you've disobeyed me, they're all going to be absolutely astonished because your city, your great city of Tyre, the headquarters, is going to be obliterated, which of course occurred when Nebuchadnezzar came down, and then later Alexander the Great finished off the job, building that causeway into their island and completely destroying it. But what's interesting, brothers and sisters, is verse 12. Because there we read of our subject. Tarshish was thy merchant, by reason of the multitude of all kind of riches. With silver, iron, tin, and lead they traded in thy fairs. And what does that tell us, brothers and sisters? Well, logically, it tells us that these were the native goods of Tarshish. Tarshish came to Tyre and gave them silver, iron, tin, and lead. So whoever Tarshish is, whoever you suggest Tarshish is, they have to have these metals in them. And you have to demonstrate that those metals were traded with the ancient Phoenicians. We'll come on to that in a little bit, God willing. So that's another massive identifier, because these metals, they're not found everywhere. In fact, tin, I think, is only found in about 4 or 5 places on the planet. So that limits us quite a bit as to where Tarshish actually is. If you actually glance down, look at verse 25. It mentions there that the ships of Tarshish did sing of thee, Tyre, in thy markets, and thou wast replenished, and made very glorious in the midst of the seas. And this brings us on to another identifying aspect of Tarshish. Again, we've got the connection with Tarshish and the sea, but we have here an indication that Tarshish was the one who replenished Tyre. So it was the ships of Tarshish which actually helped to carry goods back and forth throughout all these countries, so that Tyre could become wealthy. In other words, the ships of Tarshish traded in all these areas and brought their goods to Tyre. And at this point, brothers and sisters, I wish to spend a little bit of time, it's slightly off subject, but dealing with the topic of Eastern Tarshish. It's been suggested, well, let's just turn there, just flip back to 2 Chronicles chapter 8. You see, it's been suggested in the Brotherhood that perhaps there is actually 2 Tarshishes, 2 bases, 2 places we could call Tarshish. And I'm not actually sure that we need to necessarily come to that conclusion from the verses we're about to look at. So if you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 17 says, and this is now we're going back to the time of Solomon. Okay, so this was about 900 BC, if my memory is correct. Ezekiel's written around 600 BC, so it's written perhaps 300 years before the time of Ezekiel. And it says there that Solomon went to Ezion-Geber and to Eloth at the seaside in the land of Eden. And Huram, that's Hiram, the Tyre chap that we were talking about earlier, the king of Tyre, he sent him by the hand of his servant ships, and servants that had knowledge of the sea, and they went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir, and took thence 450 talents of gold, and brought them to King Solomon. And it's quite clear that there was a port built in Ezion-Geber. It's in modern-day Eilat in Israel, right down the south by the Red Sea down there, not to the west, to the south. And so that's where the port initially was. But then if you flick over to chapter, what are we doing next? Let me just remind myself. Chapter 9, verse 20, we read these words. Chapter 9, verse 20. And all the drinking vessels of King Solomon were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was not anything accounted of in the days of Solomon. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Huram. Every 3 years once came the ships of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. Now, it depends how we read that, brothers and sisters, because if you read it as with a break between Huram and every 3 years, it doesn't actually say an awful lot about where Tarshish might be. But if we read it as a continual paragraph, which obviously isn't in Hebrew, there could be a break or not in the Hebrew, then perhaps it indicates to us that Tarshish, wherever Tarshish was, contained gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. And those are, particularly peacocks and apes, they are famous from coming from India. And so the suggestion has been that if they've gone to Tarshish for those goods, that there's an eastern Tarshish, as well as another Tarshish that gives metals. But just read it again, brothers and sisters. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Stop. And then, every 3 years once came the ships of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they went to Tarshish from this port, necessarily. But I'll tell you another verse that does seem to indicate that. If you go over to chapter 20 and verse 36, we read this time of King Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And at verse 36, it says that Jehoshaphat joined himself with Ahaziah, him, to make ships to go to Tarshish, and they made the ships in Ezion Geber, which is down the south, which again has led some to believe that maybe if they're going to go from to Tarshish from that area, that Tarshish must be in the east. But brothers and sisters, I just want you to consider this quote from Herodotus, who wrote 440 BC, okay, so around 450 years later. He says, Libya, and he means Africa, Libya is washed on all sides by the sea, except where it joins Asia, as was first demonstrated, so far as knowledge goes, by the Egyptian king Necho, 600 BC. But that doesn't necessarily mean, brothers and sisters, that it wasn't demonstrated before that, and I'll come on to that. Who, after calling off the construction of the canal between the Nile and the Arabian Gulf, yes, the Suez Canal is an ancient project, sent out a fleet manned by a Phoenician crew with orders to sail west about the return to Egypt and the Mediterranean by the way of the Straits of Gibraltar. That's Spain, up that side. And he says the Phoenicians sailed from the Arabian Gulf into the southern ocean, and every autumn put in at some convenient spot on the Libyan coast, sowed a patch of ground and waited for next year's harvest. Now listen to this, brothers and sisters. Then, having got in their grain, they put to sea again, and after 2 full years rounded the Pillars of Hercules, that's near the Straits of Gibraltar, in the course of the 3rd year, and returned to Egypt. So what does that tell us, brothers and sisters? That the Phoenicians went right around Africa every 3 years, according to this historical record here. And what did we read? Just flick back to 2 Chronicles chapter 9. We read that the ships of Tarshish, the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Pause. And separate to that, we're suggesting every 3 years once came the ships of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory, apes and peacocks. So it's interesting we've got this connection. And what this is telling us is they actually went all the way around Africa in 3 years. And it seems a bit insane to me to suggest that it took them 3 years to get to India and back, because obviously that's hardly anything when you consider the fact that they'd have had to go all the way around Africa. And so my suggestion is that they went round Africa, but stopped in at India, and perhaps they stopped in at other places in this main trade route as they went around, pulling in from time to time to sow crops, and then coming back round again to the Middle East area. And so it seems to me, brothers and sisters, that it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to find another place for Tarshish in the east, because it's quite, you could sail from the south around Africa and possibly into the area of Britain, which we'll come on to in a minute, and then back again in 3 years in ancient times. We can't be certain, can we, about what it said about the apes and the peacocks, because it just says that they bring the apes and the peacocks, the Tarshish power does. But what we can be certain of is the passage in Ezekiel that specifically tells us that tin and lead and iron and the other one, which I've forgotten, comes from Tarshish. So that's just a slight aside, but it gives us another clue that's attached to this. It trades in global markets. It could easily pick up things from ivory from Africa or from peacocks from India and still remain in the West. And the final clue is the takeover from Tyre. Can we quickly turn to Isaiah chapter 23? So as we say, Tyre was that great Phoenician capital, and it traded, didn't it, and all over the place, and famous for its ships and trading. And as we've said, God brought a punishment against Tyre. And if you look at verse 6 In Isaiah 23, again in verse 1, in fact, the burden of Tyre. It's all about Tyre, connected with the ships of Tarshish. But then in verse 6, Tyre is told, after its destruction, to pass over to Tarshish. How, ye inhabitants of the isle, is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is of ancient days? Her own feet shall carry her afar off to sojourn. So what does that tell us then? Well, it tells us that after the destruction of Tyre, the Phoenician power, that the Phoenician influence would eventually transfer itself to Tarshish, wherever Tarshish was, and that Tarshish would take over from where Tyre left off. And it also tells us that Tarshish is afar off from Tyre. It was a long distance away. So we would expect then that whoever Tarshish was, it should be demonstrated that they've taken over from the ancient Phoenicians, that perhaps they took over from this ancient trade route, and as we say, go on up, as we saw from the other diagram I showed, that the Phoenicians were going up to Britain at that time. Whoever Tarshish is takes over that trade route. So just a very brief recap, and then I want to see who fits. We've just seen 8 clues from the Bible, and whoever we suggest Tarshish is, it has to fit with all 8. It's a trading power operating in the region of Sheba and Dedan. It's a colonial power. It's descended from Japheth and is an island or coastal power. It's a maritime power. It's located to the far west of Israel. It's a source of silver, iron, tin, and lead, and traded with Tyre of old. It trades in global markets, and it would take over from the trade of the ancient Phoenicians of Tyre. So who fits then, brothers and sisters? I'm pretty sure the only country that fits all 8, the only nation, is the British. Other nations might have 1 or 2 which might connect. So, for example, Spain, you can get all those metals in the north of Spain, but then Spain you can't really call a maritime or a colonial or a trading power operating in the region of Sheba and Dedan. And so if we keep these things in mind when we understand from the Bible, it will save us from coming up with some wild and wonderful ideas as to perhaps who Tarshish might be. I just want to show you how perfect Britain fits. And this is where we're going to look at a few, some history, but also some modern events. We've got to demonstrate that Britain's operating in the area of Saudi and Arabia and the Gulf. You know, it's very recently that David Cameron, on November the 5th, I think it was the 5th that he visited actually, that he visited Saudi Arabia, here from the Financial Times, in the next leg of a Gulf tour aimed at boosting trade and investment. Exports to the 6 states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain, rose 18% in the past year, according to the Foreign Office. So this is telling us that Britain is in the region of the Gulf. And look at this. I went on the Foreign and Commonwealth Office website to see what they were saying, Britain was saying about the Gulf area. And it says that we want the UK to be the Gulf's commercial partner of choice. British businesses and expertise has much to offer the region. An estimated $2.2 trillion in infrastructure projects is currently planned or underway in the region. Now, don't you think that's amazing, brothers and sisters? Here we have Britain, a trading power, operating in Sheba and Dedan in quite a powerful way. Is it that this is the connection which causes the merchants of Tarshish to be in the area, for them to say with Sheba and Dedan to Gog, have you come to take a spoil? What about Britain being a colonial power? Well, I'm sure I don't have to really over-egg this one. Britain obviously had a great empire of old, which we looked at in our last study. They're now independent from Britain. So we have independent powers, young grown-up lions who are their own entities and their own powers in their own right. They no longer rely on Britain. And they now are called the Commonwealth. I think there's 50-odd countries attached to that. Incidentally, nearly 20% of global trade is all done through the Commonwealth. So we have the mother lion, Britain, and we have her young lions trading in the areas of Saudi Arabia. Incidentally, that's a plaque if you go in the Lace Market just above the living room restaurant. And we've just had the Diamond Jubilee of our Queen now, haven't we? Or the Queen of Britain now, not our Queen, but you know what I mean. And here's one that was 60 years ago for Queen Victoria. And it's interesting to show how that all of these countries at that time were connected with the mother lion. And you'll notice the little lions around the side. It's a symbol Britain's adopted over the years. And so now we see them independent. But before that, they were all under the government of Britain. And again, as we mentioned, this is very much a symbol. We don't hinge our argument on this, brothers and sisters, but it's just interesting, isn't it, to consider the British and how they have identified with the lion over the years. Market Square, we have lions guarding the Market Square. Trafalgar Square in London. London's full of lions. Ask my dad; he's got tons of pictures of lions everywhere. If you're a mother or anyone, in fact, who likes eggs, you'll notice lions stamped on British eggs. Particularly mothers. Mothers notice that kind of thing. Stamps and coins and all sorts of things. Britain has identified themselves with a lion, and particularly, incidentally, in wartime. Look at this amazing poster. The Empire needs men. We've got a lion, we've got young lions, and it even says Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand all answer the call, helped by the young lions. The old lion defies his foes. Don't you think that's amazing, brothers and sisters? It's almost like the angels saying, if you understand who Tarshish is, then here are some encouraging pointers to confirm that fact. But as I say, let's not misunderstand it. We're not hinging our argument on these things, but we're just saying it's interesting to see the angels at work helping us with these things. We mentioned it was clue number 3, a descendant from Japheth, and obviously Britain does fit into that area. A maritime power. Does Britain fit? Yes. A very strong, obviously, maritime power. British Ports Association. The UK economy is the 4th largest in the world. Its ports play a vital role by handling over 95% of UK import and export tonnage. In 2010, the value of trade through British ports was around 340 billion. Ports have throughout history been a place where goods and people arrive or leave the country by sea. The UK port industry, by virtue of our long coastline and maritime history, is the largest in Europe, handling over 500 million tons of freight in 2010. It is indeed a maritime country. So that fits. Well, obviously, point number 5 fits as well, located to the west of Israel, as we noted from Joppa. And the next one is something we're just going to have to do a bit of geology on, and a little bit of history as well. So bear with me. In this section, the clue was that it's a source of silver, iron, tin, and lead. So we have to demonstrate a few things in regard to this particular clue. We can ask some questions. So the first question is does Britain naturally have these resources? And then I think we should ask, is it reasonable that these were, to believe that these were mined in ancient times? Because that's another thing we'd have to demonstrate. And finally, we have to then demonstrate any evidence to suggest that these were traded particularly with the ancient Phoenicians of Tyre, so that it can all tie in with Ezekiel chapter 27. And as we say, we think this is a real clincher in terms of who Tarshish is. In a word, does Britain have silver, iron, tin, and lead minerals? In a word, yes. And I didn't know much about how minerals were mined. I don't know about you, but since doing this research, I understand how it worked. What happened was when the Earth's crust is full of like layers of stone, and when that splits under a great pressure, different other minerals and perhaps like shells from fish and from crabs and stuff go in. They are crushed and produce what's called minerals. And so these minerals, if you take them out of the Earth's crust and melt them at about 1,000 degrees, the rock will basically disintegrate, but out will drip the metal that you want, which is quite amazing, really. So there's a whole process in there. And in ancient times, it's most probable to assume that in Britain, These metals were readily available on the surface, these minerals. So these ancient peoples would have just chipped away from the surface and got them. And then as time's gone on, obviously they've all been covered over. And so they now have to be mined. And interestingly, obviously we've got tons of mines, particularly in Cornwall. The ancient word for Britain comes from the Celtic, the land of metals, or in the Syriac, Baratanak, the land of tin. And incidentally, the Phoenician mines, the Phoenician word for Tarshish conveys the meaning of metal refinery. So the name Britain today seems to link in with this idea of being a land of metals. And this is a map of British bedrock. Now, you might have been aware that last week we were in Derbyshire, and I bored Ruth silly by taking her to the Peak District Mining Museum. And there you can see whole crates of all different minerals from around the country. And I happen to just pick out here the ones which relate to our study. Britain does have minerals for iron, lead, tin, and silver. And you melt those down and out drips the metal that you require. It does have them, so that fits. But what about the next question, which I think we need to really answer? Is it reasonable to believe that these were mined in ancient times? Well, here on the right-hand side, we have a map by a historian who's identified all the ancient Roman sites where they mined for various metals. Now, history really began with the Romans. We don't have an awful lot from the time of the Phoenicians at all to confirm or deny it, but history starts, as we say, recorded history starts. So we can see that around 43, 50 AD, this is why Britain became useful to the Romans, and perhaps that's why the Romans crossed the Channel and invaded the southern part of Britain. And if you still don't believe that Romans harvested these goods from the natives, well, here's some evidence. Took a lot of time to research these, but you can actually go to various museums to find the ingots. They call them ingots or pigs, probably because they're a pig to lift and carry around, that they formed after they'd melted out the minerals. So you've got silver from the British Museum, and all these things have stamped in it Roman identifiers. Iron from Scotland, tin in the Royal Cornwall Museum, and the museum Ruth and I went to last week, the Peak District Mining Museum, it actually had a lead ingot that had stamped in the side of it Britannia, and then it had a date or some mark as well. And it was absolutely wonderful to see that these were not only mined in ancient times, they were formed in ways that they could be carried back across to the Mediterranean countries and traded. And here is another source of evidence where Professor John F. Healy, who's a lecturer at Manchester University, he identified all these sources of Roman ore, that's those mineral metals, and incidentally for the four that we're looking at, Britannia appears in his list as well. So it's fantastic, isn't it, brothers and sisters, to see that these metals were indeed mined and carried across in those days. This is quite a famous one. This does potentially date back to Phoenician times and the time of Ezekiel. An ancient St. Mau's tin ingot. It was dragged up in the port of St. Mau's when they were trying to churn it out so they had bigger ships in. And they think that this, because of the shape of it and the age of it, was perhaps formed around 2000 BC, which is pretty amazing, found in Britain. So we can be sure that these metals were mined in ancient times in Britain. Final question on this one. Were these metals traded with the Phoenicians? Now that's a bit trickier, isn't it? That's a little bit trickier. As we say, history does not say an awful lot about the Phoenicians. But they were in Britain. We can establish that for a fact. Here's something from the BBC a couple of years ago. They found this skeleton near Stonehenge, and it says, chemical tests on teeth from an ancient burial near Stonehenge indicate that the person in the grave grew up around the Mediterranean Sea. The bones belong to a teenager who died 3,550 years ago, was buried with a distinctive amber necklace. So the Phoenicians were in Britain almost 3,550 years ago. It brings us beyond the time when Ezekiel wrote these things. The Mediterranean people had travelled to England. But this find, I think, only recently couple of years ago really confirms that Britain had connections with Phoenicia of old. They found a ship off of Cornwall, Bronze Age shipwreck artifacts found near Salcombe. And guess what was on the shipwreck? They had these ingots, artifacts including copper and tin ingots, gold bracelets, and a bronze sword were found near Salcombe by amateur archaeologists last year. Amazing. We have a trading ship, a Phoenician ship, which has on board over 300, I think it was, of these ingots. So it's clearly trading them. It wasn't just a few loose change in your pocket. These are big pieces of metal, which would have been then used to trade. And what's interesting about tin is, if you want to make bronze like the Greeks did when they were fighting, you have to have copper and tin, melt them together, and it creates a really, really strong and powerful metal, bronze. And so for the ancient world, particularly the Greeks, it was essential to get hold of this tin stuff. They had copper, but they needed tin. And so the suggestion is that this was the source for the Greek bronze, which occurred back in all that time back in time, and this was the trade from that. There's a few bits more of evidence which I'd love to share with you. I know we're running out of time drastically, but does anyone know what a periplus is? Well, a periplus is like a list of ports. So if you're an ancient trader, you'd go to a port and you'd say, right, I've been to this port, and then you'd take a note of what they were exporting and importing. So you'd say, all right, they're exporting turtle shells, and they're importing purple dye. Wonderful. And then you make a note of it. And then you travel around the place. And after a while, this periplus would become quite valuable because you'd want to know, if you were in a port, you'd think, crumbs, these guys are selling these dirt cheap and I need somewhere else to trade them. Oh, on my periplus, I can find that the port down the road wants them. So I'll take those goods, buy them, and sell them to that port because that's what's in need over that area. And this ancient periplus, the periplus of the Ethiopian Sea in the eastern side of the world, is quite famous. It's around the time of 30 AD. So, 600 years off of Ezekiel's time, but still important because it lists in order the ports and coastal landmarks with approximate intervening distances that the captain of a vessel could expect to find along shore by this merchant. And what's interesting is that he mentions 4 places in regard particularly to tin. He mentions them there: Avalius, Cana, Ozine, and Bakar. And what's fantastic about that is that each of those places imported tin, but none of them exported tin. And he even says where they got the tin from. He says, there are imported into this place, he's talking about Cana, from Egypt, a little wheat and wine, as at Musa, clothing in the Arabian style, plain and common, and most of it spurious, and copper and tin. And he's saying that they came from Egypt. Now, what's interesting is that tin was not mined in Egypt. So the question is where did the Egyptians get their tin from? So we have to find other evidence from it. But what it tells us is that wherever the ancient world got their tin from to make all their bronze, it wasn't in the east. So we've got to look west. Here's that chap Herodotus again, cracking beard. And what did he say about these things? He said, 440 BC, we're only 200 years, under 200 years off of when Ezekiel wrote. This is fascinating. He was in Greece, and he says, of that part of Europe nearest to the west, I am not able to speak with decision. I by no means believe that the barbarians give the name of Eridanus to a river which empties itself into the northern sea, whence it is said, our amber comes. Neither am I better acquainted with the islands called the Cassiterides, which from which we are said to have our tin. So he's talking about 2 things there. He's talking about amber and tin. And he's not sure, he's not acquainted particularly where they're from, but he knows that one comes from a river, and the tin particularly comes from islands called the Cassiterides. And then he says, the name Eridanus is certainly not barbarous. It is of Greek derivation, and as I should conceive, introduced by one of our poets. I have endeavoured, but without success, to meet with someone who, from ocular observation, might describe to me the sea which lies in that part of Europe. It is nevertheless certain that both our tin and our amber are brought from those extreme regions. So where did the ancient world get their tin? According to a man who lived at that time, from the western extreme end of Europe, from islands. It's really important that we understand the tin came from islands. It didn't come from Spain, it came from an island, and particularly a group of islands called the Christadelphians. So we're starting to build up this picture that tin came from the western islands. And when we go through other historical evidence, Julius Caesar, just before he invades Britain, he says the island is well peopled, full of houses built after the manner of the Gauls, and abounds in cattle. They use brass money and iron rings of a certain weight. The provinces remote from the sea produce tin, and those upon the coast iron. So we have Britain in ancient times, already before the Romans get there, producing metal. A great evidence to suggest that they had it to trade with the Phoenicians. And here's one, Theodorus from 8 BC. He makes a very interesting point. Now we shall speak something concerning the tin that is dug and gotten there, the Christadelphians. They that inhabit the British promontory of Belrium, I think that's a place in Cornwall, by reason of their converse with the merchants, are more civilized and courteous to strangers than the rest. We're a bit uncivilized up here in the Midlands. He says, these are the people that make the tin, which with a great deal of care and labour they dig out of the ground, and that being rocky, the metal is mixed with some veins of earth, out of which they melt the metal and refine it. Another piece of evidence, brothers and sisters, that Britain was trading and using metal. Last historical quote. The Christadelphians are 10 in number. We don't know quite why he says they're 10, but it is thought that perhaps the lay of the land was different back in 18 AD, says Strabo. It says they're 10 in number and lie near each other in the ocean toward the north from the haven of Artabri. Of the metals, they have tin and lead, which with skins they barter with the merchants for earthenware, salts, and brazen vessels. And now, this is fascinating. Why is it we don't have anything from the Phoenicians telling us this? Listen to what he has to say. He says, formerly, the Phoenicians alone from Gades engrossed this market, hiding the navigation from all others. So the Phoenicians had been to Britain, and they were there. And then it says, when the Romans followed a certain shipmaster that they might discover the market of metals, the jealous shipmaster willfully stranded his vessel on a shoal, misleading those who were tracking him to the same destruction. Escaping from the shipwreck by means of a fragment of the ship, he was indemnified for his losses out of the public treasury. So when people tried to follow the Phoenicians were so fanatical about keeping secret that Britain had all this wonderful metal that they would happily run their ships aground to stop people understanding the secret. And that's perhaps why Herodotus couldn't find one person that had been to the Christadelphians. He knew that they were there, but he hadn't found a person that had been there because the Phoenicians were so secretive. So that's point 6. I think we've clearly demonstrated all those points that Britain fits the bill. It has those metals, and it traded in them in ancient times, according to all the historical references I could find anyway in my research. It trades in global markets. Well, clearly Britain does. London, obviously, is a massive player in the world stage. In fact, it's the 4th largest stock exchange in the world. It incidentally, interestingly, talking about the fact that Britain needs to be connected with Sheba and Dedan and the Gulf states, it's incidentally owned, look at that, the key stakeholders are a Qatar country, a company, 15%, and a Dubai company, 21%. There are real solid connections between Britain and Saudi Arabia and those states from that area, the Gulf area. And we read here, the exchange is the most international of all the world's stock exchanges, with around 3,000 companies from over 70 countries admitted to its trading on its market. So the London Stock Exchange trades in the global markets and clearly helps to ferry goods around the world. And we said, didn't we, that clue number 8 was it was to take over from Tyre. So whoever Tarshish is, we have to demonstrate took over perhaps these ancient trade routes. Well, this was a slide I actually showed last week. to demonstrate the activities of the East India Trading Company, who did take over those markets. You know, they were famous, weren't they, for going to the east. They also went to the west, didn't they, to the Caribbean and to Africa and to those areas there and the terrible atrocities of the slave trade. But we can still see, nonetheless, that Britain did take over that role as a trading power between east, west, through the Mediterranean. So we've seen then, really, brothers and sisters, that Britain fits all of the Tarshish clues. You know, if another country arose which fitted all 8, then perhaps we might start to think, well, perhaps that's Tarshish. But I very much doubt it. I think we can be very, very confident, for these reasons demonstrated scripturally and historically, that Britain is the only fit for Tarshish. And if anyone suggests anything otherwise, then I'd suggest that they need to do this study that we've done, collate the evidence, and to sum up. But what does it all mean, brothers and sisters? What does it mean? Well, when we come back to Ezekiel chapter 38, the signs of things that are going to happen just before Christ returns are clearly set out, aren't they? We have the Gogian Confederacy on one hand. On the other hand, we've got Sheba and Dedan and the young lions. So we get a picture, don't we? We've been given a vision, brothers and sisters, to encourage us. As we look out at the world, we actually see these things occurring. Tarshish, Britain, is going to be separate from these other nations, from the European powers. It's going to be operating in the area of the Gulf. Look at this. This was only the 15th of September this year. An armada of international naval power massing in the Gulf as Israel prepares an Iran strike. An armada of US and British naval power is massing in the Persian Gulf in the belief that Israel is considering a preemptive strike against Iran's suspected nuclear weapons program. Western leaders are convinced that Iran will retaliate in any attack by attempting to mine or blockade the shipping lane through which passes around 18 million barrels of oil every day, approximately 35% of the world's oil traded by sea. A blockade would have a catastrophic effect on the fragile economies of Britain, Europe, the United States, and Japan, all of which rely heavily on oil and gas supplies from the Gulf. So we have Britain in the area. These are vital supplies for the British economy. And so we have them moving into position to defend it. Only the other week, Cameron, he met with the states of the Gulf, and he says, and the Independent reported, it is understood that the government is keen to reassure its Gulf allies that they would have Britain's full diplomatic and military backing should tensions with Iran escalate further. Britain is in that area and is diplomatically and militarily there. Are you come to take a spoil? It's clearly coming to pass before our eyes. If we could see these things in our newspapers day to day, I think we get very, very encouraged. The Black Duke, it's a ship, will be on guard in the Arabian Gulf this winter and spring. The Type 23 frigate and a crew of 215 left Plymouth last month and will be policing busy shipping lanes. Monmouth will disrupt and deter piracy to protect shipping on a vital maritime trade route. You see, we don't really think about this because we just go to Sainsbury's and pick up our food. But all that stuff comes through some of those areas, and particularly when we fill up our cars, it's a lot of it coming from the Gulf area, from Sheba and Dedan. What about Britain separating itself from Europe and becoming independent? Well, that's clearly on the cards. Look at this from last year. You remember Britain vetoed a really vital item that the European Union were putting forward, the new treaty, which was to take away more powers. And we read from the Telegraph there that the title was EU Treaty, David Cameron stands as the lone man of Europe. And the Telegraph suggested that the actions of Britain last year could end with departure from the EU. So Britain will be separate in a location where they can challenge the European powers. The Daily Express is championing this idea of being independent with its campaign to get Britain out of the EU now. That's one of the covers that they had. We demand our country back. The British public, because of reports like these on the screen, are sick to death of the EU stamping all over the sovereignty of the British. And so we can see, brothers and sisters, Britain on the way out of Europe. We can see them becoming independent to trade with their young lion nations, and we can see them very much being independent. There's news stories galore. These are not even, I've not even had to go back in time. These are all, this year and the last few months. The majority, look at that one, majority of British public want to leave Europe, the independent, 26th of November. So we're nearly there in terms of the signs. And when Britain does leave the EU, let's think about, brothers and sisters, this prophecy here in Ezekiel chapter 38. Now, it's all been very interesting, and as I say, we've done a bit of a study, and it's been intellectual head knowledge up until now. But what we don't want to do is just have that knowledge banging around in our heads and think, well, that's interesting, and go our separate ways and carry on as if we hadn't understood any of this. Because knowledge brings responsibility, doesn't it? And what this is telling us is, as we've seen these signs come to pass and coming to pass before us, what it needs to make us do, brothers and sisters, is pull our socks up, and is to prepare for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so as we see then Bible prophecy being worked out before our very eyes, we can be confident, can't we, that God is at work, that Christ is coming. And so the question that I think the Scriptures is saying to all of us here tonight is, are we ready? And if not, then let us get ready for the return of our Messiah.